Hey there guys, my name is Justin. I'm going to be going over the process of how we transformed my 30-year-old hood from this into this. Now, full disclaimer, before we go further into the video, this was my first video. This was my first time ever recording. I didn't know anything about camera settings, and I know just a little bit more now as I've made about 2 or 3 videos since. So bear with me, and this is a learning process, but we're going to give it our best shot. So we're going to be walking through the steps of everything we need to do. The first step being, we're going to strip everything off the hood. We're going to take it down to bare nothing, and we're going to go from there and see how we can make this work. So our first part of the process is we're going to assess our panel. Now I am going to apologize in advance as I only have one picture of the panel, but this was the hood prior to anything. As you can tell, the hood's in pretty rough conditions. We have some spray paint, a lot of paint fade, we have parts that have been completely sanded through, we have bare metal that's been exposed and now oxidizing, and a lot of issues that go with it. So what we need to focus on is getting our substrate correct. Now what does substrate mean? Our substrate is going to be the underlying layer, which in this case is going to be our hood itself in its bare form. Now in a perfect world, we want to make our metal as straight as possible, so all we have to do is just prep the surface and paint on top. Now in a realistic world, that's where we're going to have things like body filler, we're going to have putty, we're going to have multiple stages of primers and different primers for different applications, and a bunch of other things. But the first process is we want to get our substrate as bare as possible. So I want to remove everything. So I want to start off first by stripping everything. Now there's mechanical and chemical ways of stripping. Mechanical is take some sort of sandpaper, any abrasive, and just scrape the surface off. This works great, but it's a little slower. What I personally did was I used aircraft stripper that you could just purchase at any auto parts store, and I laid a generous coat of it and let it sit there for quite some time. So now after some time and a good pressure cleaning after, our hood is now mechanically stripped, meaning all the paint is off of it, but the oxidation still exists there. So what we're going to do for the rust is we want to completely stop the process of rusting. If we sand the rust until it's smooth and then start doing our body work over it, it's going to look fine for now, and it may look fine for a couple years. But at some point in time, we never stop the actual chemical process of rusting. Now for the chemical process, I use a chemical called OSFO. OSFO is great because it stops the chemical process of oxidation. Now how it does this is it pretty much removes all the oxygen from the rust. Now once our rust was neutralized, it's actually time for us to begin getting our substrate in a good shape for us to start our process of body work on top of it. And for us to ensure that we've sanded every single piece of the panel, we're going to apply something called guide coat. Guide coat essentially is just spray paint, but it's very dry and very thin. Now we're going to begin first sanding our entire panel with 80 grit, and then we're going to be following the 80 grit with 180 grit. Purpose of this is we're trying to first create a very coarse grit to actually smoothen the panel itself, and we were mainly focusing on these areas that were oxidizing to blend them into the rest of the panel so that way everything has a smooth finish when we're done. Now the purpose of the 180 grit is to have a much finer scratch, that way once we lay down our epoxy primer, it's easier for it to fill the 180 grit than it will the 80 grit. Our first coat of primer, we lay down an epoxy primer. The purpose of epoxy is epoxy does a very good job at chemically bonding to metal and creating a surface that's going to be a lot more resistant to elements in the future. So following our epoxy primer, we lay down a polyester primer, and this is a high build primer. And the purpose of this primer is it applies very thick, so that way we can go back later as we can sand through the primer itself without touching our substrate. Now there's 3 main ones, there's small ones here and there, but I'm only going to focus on these 3 for now. We have a low spot here, a low spot here. For these low spots, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead. I have some Axis body filler here. I'm gonna mix up some body filler with some hardener, and we'll lay down just a little bit here and here, just 2 little skim coats. So now we're going to be blocking our panel. Blocking the panel is the way we get it truly straight. Now if you may notice, my blocks don't look like traditional blocks. These are actually called true blocks. They're an acrylic bottom with a polyurethane top. They're amazing, they work great. They work just as great as all other blocks. I just find them very comfortable to hold in my hand for a long period of time. Now the acrylic bottom is really what determines which block to use, as each acrylic bottom is a different thickness. You want to find a block that's just thick enough that it can easily bend and conform to the shape of the panel, but not overly rigid where you're actually going to be warping your panel to try to get your block to sit flat. Now whenever we use our block, we're going to be doing what's called a cross hatch pattern, which is basically making an X. We're going to start from one side of the dent and move diagonally to the other side of the dent and then work our way back. and then we're going to be continuing alternating sides. Now what this is going to do is this is going to help us verify what part of our panel is not flat, what part of our panel has high spots, and what part of our panel has a low spot. With conjunction of our guide spray, we're actually going to notice what goes what very fast. So as you notice, we're almost immediately going to have a small little circle that starts to form before anything else is even touched. This is letting us know that this particular spot is really high. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our hammer and dollies and we're simply just going to push them down. Now we're going to continue block sanding the areas. And whenever we block sand, we're using 180 grit during our bodywork phase. The reason why we use 180 is it's a very sharp grit and it's a grit that will last a long time. It'll help us during our rough cut of most of our bodywork. And the scratches to fill after aren't very hard to take out 180 scratches with our 220 grit scratches. And we're focusing mainly on the 3 areas of the hood that need the most amount of bodywork. Once I complete those 3 areas, then I start the process of blocking the entire hood. Again, the areas that need the bodywork, we sand 180 grit, and the areas that we're just blocking the hood just to make sure the whole hood is straight, as well as we're evening out the entire primer, we're going to be doing the 220 and above. Now as we sand, you're going to notice that we're going to have areas that are going to keep this gray coloration. This gray color is just letting us know that this area is low enough that we haven't been able to take the guide coat out this area. So now we know these are areas that we need to apply body filler. The spot that we used to have that was high is now low. Now we will add body filler and then we'll raise the spot up and then we start sanding it. As well as the other areas in which we already applied body filler, you can tell when you're not done sanding. If you notice around the edges, we still have a lot of the guide coat, and this is just letting us know that there's a great difference in height. So these areas we're going to continue sanding and we're going to feather everything out until we have a nice smooth surface. So now we're sanding our body filler. The goal here is we're trying to feather in all the edges to the panel. Once we feather in all of our edges, and since we are using a block, we're going to know that our panel now is straight. For the bulk of the cutting, we're going to be using a 180 grit. Once we get relatively close to where we want to be, we're going to switch it up to a 220 grit. The reason why we change grits is 220 grit is much more fine, and it's going to be a lot easier for a high build primer to cover a 220 grit without much shrink back. Now what is shrink back? Shrink back essentially is when you use too coarse of a grit and it makes too large of a gap. From there, the primer itself can't fill that gap. Over time, that primer eventually is going to shrink into the gap, and then what's going to happen is all the layers above it are going to start shrinking as well. So you may notice some body panels may look phenomenal, and then as time passes by, then you start seeing all these scratch marks come out of nowhere. And it's just due to the fact of not being very thorough with your grits, not using the proper grits, and not allowing time for your primer to actually shrink. Now to prevent our shrink back, we're going to sand up to 220 grit. That way as we apply our primer on top of it, it has an easier chance of actually filling those in. Now as we get closer to have our finished body work, we're going to start noticing a lot of these little pinholes start coming out. Now we may have pinholes, small areas where there might have been air trapped under our body filler, so now we have little gaps and such. And these are perfectly normal. Body filler isn't for your perfect body work. Body filler is just to fill most of the body. From there, we're going to be using putty or glaze on top, and those are going to be to fill our small imperfections. So now that all of our body work's done, it's time for the next part, which is going to be sealing our panel. Now during the bodywork phase, we did have a lot of spots that went through back to bare metal. So for that, we're going to be using an epoxy primer. The advantage of an epoxy primer is it chemically bonds better to metal, as well as it creates a better moisture barrier for future purposes. We're trying to have this panel last a long time, so any spot that is bare metal, we want to first cover with epoxy before we do anything else. Whenever we mix our epoxy, we're going to do 1-to-1. We're going to do 1 part epoxy to 1 part activator. The easy way to do this is we're just going to take the milliliters of our mixing cup, we're going to go up to about 250, and then we're going to add another 250 for a total of 500. Now before we can paint, we want to first clean the surface. So we're going to take our surface prep, which is a wax and grease remover, and we're going to vigorously apply it to the panel, and then we're going to dry it off. From now, it's time to actually paint. Now when we paint, we want to create what's called a wet edge, and our wet edge is we start from one side of the panel, and as we start spraying, we push it towards the other side of the panel. As we do a wet edge, we're going to have a much more consistent uniformity in how the paint's going to lay, as the paint's going to constantly be wet and it's going to dry all at the same time. As we paint, we're going to paint like a machine. Machines don't stop moving, so neither should we. We're just going to constantly keep pushing our wet edge to the other side of the panel. We're going to work through however tired our arm may be until we finish our panel completely. And once we finish spraying our primer, we're going to let it sit for 2 to 3 days. And this is going to cause for some time of shrink back. Epoxy primer doesn't cover very well, so any of these 220 scratches, some may show through. So we're going to grab our epoxy, we're going to let it sit for 2 to 3 days, and then we're going to go ahead and continue on with our bodywork process. So now our hood is primed in epoxy primer, which means we have fully covered all the metal spots, and now we're ready to continue the body work. So now in the next episode, we're gonna take the whole hood, we're gonna sand it 220, we're gonna apply urethane primer, and when we're gonna get ready for the rest of our body work and our final touches before we actually get ready for paint. That's gonna be it for today. If you guys have any questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, please leave them down below. Like, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for more.